Boa noite. Ele é o cientista encarregado de estudar e interpretar a revolução que a tecnologia digital está provocando no mundo. No centro do Roda Viva está o professor Andrew Lippman, diretor e um dos fundadores do Laboratório de Mídia do Instituto de Tecnologia de Massachusetts, dos Estados Unidos, que está aqui no Brasil a convite da Universidade de Comunicação Total Fisher Justus. O professor Andrew Lippman é formado em engenharia elétrica e está no Instituto de Tecnologia de Massachusetts há 28 anos. Ele trabalha com uma equipe de 30 pesquisadores do Laboratório de Mídia, onde estão sendo desenvolvidos 180 projetos, todos empenhados em desenvolver tecnologias que venham a facilitar o dia a dia das pessoas e aumentar a oferta de entretenimento doméstico. Estudioso de processos digitais que vão definir a televisão do futuro. Lippman trabalha também com um programa destinado a desenvolver computadores simples e extremamente baratos, que poderão se interligar a todas as redes e se tornarem em pouco tempo a principal fonte de comunicação, lazer, informação e aprendizado de muita gente em todo o mundo. Para entrevistar o cientista Andrew Lippman, nós convidamos o jornalista Rodrigo Mesquita, que é diretor da agência Estado. Ibsen Spartacus, diretor editorial da editora Nova Cultural. Marcos Vetterais, presidente da editora da revista Internet World. Norval Baitello, diretor da Faculdade de Comunicação da Universidade Católica de São Paulo. Peter Moon, editor do Isto É Online. Hélio Gorovitz, diretor de Mundo Digital da revista Exame. E Marco Chiaretti, editor do Universo Online. O Roda Viva é transmitido em rede nacional para todos os estados brasileiros. Lembramos que hoje, infelizmente, você não poderá fazer perguntas, nem por telefone ou fax ou pela internet, porque este está gravado. Professor Andrew Lippman, boa noite. Good evening.
Good evening.
Professor, eu gostaria que inicialmente o senhor nos dissesse a respeito da rede de comunicações internet. O que é que isto significa para o desenvolvimento da liberdade no mundo, ou seja, da liberdade total das comunicações, uma vez que, no passado, alguns regimes totalitários tentaram controlar os meios de comunicação. Eu gostaria que o senhor nos dissesse o seguinte: seria possível um novo controle, seja de que governo for, em cima da rede internet?
First of all, you understand what the Internet is. The Internet began 25 years ago as a vehicle for very reliable communications between computers. It was begun by the Defense Department, and it was intended to be, in its early days, a communications medium for researchers who were doing, by and large, defense-related research in the United States and the rest of the world. In the last 4 years, really 3, the Internet has exploded out of the laboratory and into the general population at large. I understand almost 2 million people in Brazil are wired, as we call it, and 40 million people in the United States, and about 60 to 80 million people around the world. Now, what the Internet has become is it has become a global, virtually free telephone system for people around the world to communicate using their computer to do that communications. And as this has developed, leaders around the world have come to recognize that it's impossible to control it and it's impossible to stop it. For example, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, who ruled Singapore with an iron fist for 25 years and controlled people's access, gave an interview in the United States Wall Street Journal about 18 months ago, and he said it was impossible to control, that in an age of global communications and multimedia, you could not do what I did before, and the people will have their voice. 1 month ago, I was at the United Nations, involved in the Second International Television Forum, and this was a gathering of people from around the world who were, by and large, in the broadcast industry and communications industry, and they were concerned with the future of television. And a very interesting remark was made by the Russian delegate. And he said, I spent 19 years trying to control what people could access. We even have railroads with different tracks so that even the trains can't go between Russia and Europe, but you can't do it. I gave up. I give up. So I think that leaders around the world are recognizing that this kind of communication is a force for freedom and democratization for all people around the world.
Rodrigo, por favor.
No final dos anos 60, nos inícios dos anos 70, a comunidade global, o que havia de mais sofisticado da comunidade financeira global começou a se conectar através de computadores e redes de comunicação. Foram 20 anos de aprendizado para a gente assistir o que a gente assiste hoje, de trânsito e fluxo de capitais pelo mundo inteiro, sem o Estado Nacional ter poder de controlar isso. Que contraponto o senhor faz entre a sociedade no futuro, quando a internet vira a ser uma commodity para todo mundo e você tiver uma população educada, que sabe manusear esse instrumental? Que mundo o senhor vê nesse futuro?
Well, first of all, I wish we could get there as quickly as your question. But getting people around the world connected and getting people around the world educated in the way that they have to be in the 21st century in order to use these kinds of communication systems is one of the major tasks that's before us. The more enlightened segments of society, in particular the financial community, adopt these kinds of technologies and these techniques much more quickly. And I would suspect that that's at least part of the reason why one doesn't look to gold as the storehouse of value anymore, because communications, in a sense, has replaced gold as the vehicle by which financial information travels around. But as that moves from within the financial houses into the broader population at large, then that means that your financial institutions are all global, and that money can move from one portion of the world to another portion of the world instantly. And what that means is development and economic opportunity moves across the rest of the world instantly. 200 years ago, in order for a country to develop itself, that country needed an accident of geography. It needed to be on a river, it needed to be on a trade route, it needed to have railroads, it needed to be near those kinds of things that were used for the transportation of goods. In the time that's we're entering now, it is the transportation of bits that is a way for a country to become immensely powerful in the coming world. And the transportation of bits doesn't require any geographic accident. So that's going to be a mammoth opportunity for people in the developing world.
Daqui a quanto tempo seria possível uma pessoa dirigindo um carro e acessar a internet? Utilizar a internet a partir do seu próprio automóvel. Nós estamos distantes disso?
Well, this year cars were demonstrated that had internet connectivity, and they were exhibited as showcases. So they had television screens in the back of the front seats for the people in the rear seats to watch, and they had television sets for the passengers. And they had voice communication for the driver and displays of geography. But they were still using the car to communicate with home, with the center, with some place relatively far away from you. I think as the internet moves into cars and motion and transportation, then you're going to start to see our transportation systems cooperate, much the same way as ants in an ant colony start to cooperate all among themselves. And I suspect that some of the more interesting things you'll be doing is communicating with the other cars. In particular, if you want to get home 10 minutes early from work, you'll ask the other cars which roads are crowded and which roads are empty, and you'll find out where the best gas stations are. There are no technical barriers to that kind of thing happening tomorrow. What's been slow is that the automotive industry has been slow to fold communications into what it's done, partly because the automotive industry is not very strong in research. They're very strong in production, but they're not very strong in research. So I suspect that'll be fairly soon.
Ibsen.
Professor, há poucos dias ocorreu um fato que ganhou bastante destaque após ser noticiado pela internet. Esse fato está relacionado à denúncia de que o presidente Bill Clinton teria tido relações com uma estagiária da Casa Branca. Enfim, isso está criando uma grande é um fato que está tendo grande repercussão. Esse fato foi inicialmente noticiado por um site da internet, após a notícia ter sido censurada pela direção da revista Newsweek. Um repórter da Newsweek já detinha todas as informações, com a reportagem pronta, a reportagem foi suspensa, a publicação da reportagem, pela direção da Newsweek. Queria saber uma avaliação da sua parte sobre em que medida a notícia que corre pela internet pode forçar com que os meios de comunicação se tornem as notícias de acesso mais democrático. De outro lado, que riscos, pelo ponto de vista, por exemplo, dos direitos individuais e pelo ponto de vista dos critérios éticos mais relevantes da informação, isso pode representar?
Well, oh my goodness, that's a very, very complicated question. First of all, news on the internet is news, just like Newsweek, just like the newspaper, just like television. It's no different. The internet is a news medium, and the news that you get on the internet is the same as the news that you would get elsewhere. And major news outlets use the internet as part of their distribution vehicles. The only difference is on the internet, everybody's a publisher. And if everybody's a publisher and everybody's an editor, then the trick is to find the editors and the publisher that you trust. And when you use traditional media, you are implicitly making a relationship between you and the editor that you trust. There is the possibility of information on the internet, and there's the possibility of misinformation on the internet. Exactly the same as is true in the real world, where there is the possibility to be led by the media and the possibility to be misled by the media. And in America, some of the things we've heard about Bill Clinton have been particularly misleading lately, not necessarily leading. So, in essence, the internet and the traditional news media are very much the same, with the one exception of the fact that everybody's a publisher. Now, when everybody's a publisher, it's awful hard to tell the difference between what you can rely on and what you can't. And so what happens on the network is very much the same as what happens in the real world, and that is you gravitate to clusters of trust, areas where you know that what you're going to learn is reliable, areas that your friends go for their information, and in the near term, what's going to happen is you'll start to use your own computer to do that kind of filtering for you and to make the distinction between what's reliable information, what's rapid information, and what's misleading information. So the important thing to understand is that the internet is a news medium already, but it's a news medium that hasn't had any of the history of control that the traditional news media have, and that's what we're inventing on the fly.
Marcos, por favor.
Sr. Lippman, o senhor falou, numa entrevista do ano passado, que a massificação dos computadores não representava um risco para os jornais, mas que a vantagem dos jornais não ia durar mais do que 5 anos. O que o senhor acha que pode acontecer nos próximos 5 anos? O senhor acredita que uma boa parte dos leitores atuais dos jornais vão migrar, vão passar a ter essas notícias via internet?
Did I really say that newspapers were going to disappear in 5 years?
Not disappear, não desaparecer. O senhor falou que hoje os computadores não representam um risco para os jornais, mas que a vantagem dos computadores, a vantagem dos jornais desaparece em 5 anos.
Yeah. Right. There are two things that are true, okay? For most of the people like us today, computers are not a threat to existing media. Computers exist independent of existing media. When you read the newspaper, that is an activity you're used to doing, you engage in, and I don't think you have any problem making a distinction between reading a newspaper and a distinction between that and browsing on the World Wide Web. My daughter, who's 11, doesn't need a convergence of television and computers. She's quite happy doing one set of things with her computer and doing another set of things when she watches television. So there's no implicit threat to any existing medium by the advent of computing, with the exception of the fact that our time is limited. And so what you're seeing in the United States is that television viewing is down because people have been diverted away from it. And that diversion is probably both necessary and threatening, and something that the television industry can't likely do anything about. But I think that the newspaper, like the television, like the telephone, like radio, is a medium that has hit such a wonderfully resonant chord in society that it's unlikely that the newspaper itself is going to disappear by virtue of any other medium. What's going to happen is those new media will come along, and there will be a new balance created between newspapers, television, radio, and the telephone, and the computer will just become one participant in that field of media. And that's still not a large number, so I still don't think it's a threat.
Professor.
Now, having said that, there's another part of the equation that's important to understand, and that is existing media can also evolve. You needn't regard the computer as an invasion from the outside. You can regard the computer as being part of what the job of a traditional newspaper does. And you've seen that, of course, in the real world of news. The news that you get today is delivered and processed within the newspaper's production offices by a computer. In fact, within 2 years of the invention of the telegraph, there were already news wire services, and that was the first use of that. So these media tend not to be static. I think what's exciting on the horizon for the printed newspaper is to think about how to make that display, that huge piece of paper that in fact is a display, just like a computer screen, but nowadays a lot more static. How do we make that display more dynamic? And I'll give you an example. One of the ways that you can do that is to, instead of print with regular ink on it, print with electronic ink. And make a newspaper that can change during the course of the day. Make a newspaper where that display itself is a subscription. And you buy it in the morning, and as you walk past the newsstand in the afternoon, you get the latest news and the headlines and the changes in those kinds of stories.
And maybe this media will be flexible also?
Well, we're doing work on the laboratory on electronic ink, where indeed you print it on paper. Mm-hmm. So it would be more than flexible. It would be the same kind of paper that you would have today. Mm-hmm. But the point is that the newspaper itself is the display end of a vast digital network already. And there's no reason to believe that we can't improve that display as well to make it be a full-fledged partner in a digital world.
Okay. Mr. Lippman. A maior parte das vezes em que se faz alguma comparação entre a difusão de informações pela internet e outros meios de comunicação é sempre tido, os meios impressos são sempre tidos como os mais vulneráveis. Mas até pelas tecnologias já disponíveis, como as web machines que existem nos Estados Unidos, é possível pensar que talvez a concorrência seja mais imediata com a televisão. Como é que o senhor encara isso?
My suspicion is that what you're saying is really only true for garbage media. Okay, for media that had no reason to exist already, and it's easy for that kind of media to be displaced. But if you look at the history of the media that have become popular with people, those media don't disappear. They take on a new level or role. Right now, in the United States, there are 5 major networks, and those 5 major networks can command 50% of the population time in the evening. That is a historical anomaly. There is no reason in the world why as few as 5 publishers should be able to command half of the entire audience. So when you hear that things like television are likely to lose their grip and power because of competition from computers, internets, or men from Mars, almost anything, what you're really hearing is you're hearing the voice of 5 broadcasters complaining about the fact that the technological limitation that allowed them to be the only game in town is disappearing. That doesn't mean television is disappearing. That means that the virtual monopoly that those 5 broadcasters had is dissolving. That doesn't mean TV will disappear at all. The same thing is true of newspapers. The same thing is true of theater. The same thing is true of radio. The monopoly is disappearing, and the means of communication are becoming democratized, not just by the internet, but simply by the technical evolution of those kinds of media themselves. they don't go away because of that. What they do is they take on a role in society that is not artificially inflated by any technological means.
Mas essa expectativa já não havia quando surgiram as TVs a cabo, ou quando elas começaram a se multiplicar no início da década de 70?
Yes, to a certain extent it did. And before the 1970s, when cable television in the United States really caught on, there were only 3 networks, and they had 90% of the audience. And their audience has been diminishing and diminishing and diminishing ever since, and now there's 5. But there's still only 5. Okay? And the difference between 3 and 5 is not great. And you hear about cable systems that have 100 channels and that have 500 channels. But really, that's only taking a piece of the audience away at a time. Imagine instead if, instead of a cable system with 100 or 500 channels, you had a cable system with 200 million channels. And on that cable system, you could tune in not just every television station that was on the air anywhere in the world, but a television station done by your daughter who's doing a school play, or a television station done like in Massachusetts, where they did nothing more than aim a TV camera at a falcon's nest in a skyscraper and put a little bit of weather at the bottom of the screen and soft music in the background. And the television show of the falcon in a skyscraper, a bird, was more popular than the 6 o'clock evening news in that town at times. So imagine a future now where not just 5 or 100 broadcasters have access to your cable, but 200 million of them do. Okay? That's when we'll really reach the full maturity of television, and that's when it will take its place along all sorts of other media.
Peter, por favor. Peter.
Sr. Lippman, depois de muito tempo de pesquisa, no final desse ano deve começar a TV de alta definição, que é uma TV com uma qualidade muito boa de quadros, a imagem e tal. E as emissoras vão ter que gastar muito dinheiro para trocar as suas câmeras, o equipamento para a nova TV de alta definição. Só que o senhor pesquisa a TV do futuro. E na sua webpage, o senhor coloca que a TV de alta definição vai ser lançada, mas eles estão errados, porque essa é uma TV que privilegia a qualidade e não a interatividade, como a TV digital que o senhor propõe vir a ser a TV do futuro. Bom, em virtude da quantidade de dinheiro, fala-se de dezenas de bilhões de dólares, que as emissoras vão ter que gastar para trocar todos os seus equipamentos para transmitir em alta definição. A TV do futuro não é de fato de alta definição e não a digital e interativa que o senhor defende?
No. Next.
No? Why? Why not?
Because it's the television that nobody wanted. First of all, I can address the monetary costs in the United States much more easily than I can elsewhere. It's not billions of dollars that television broadcasters have to spend in order to broadcast high definition. It's millions of dollars. It's seconds of advertising time, not years of advertising time. So the entire cost of upgrading your plant to broadcast high definition television is less money than the broadcasters get in 3 or 4 or 10 or 15 of the commercials that ran on the Super Bowl in the United States yesterday, and far less than it would cost them if they wanted to buy the equivalent broadcast bandwidth or spectrum from the FCC or the federal government. So in fact, high definition television from the broadcaster's point of view, and don't tell this to my friends in the broadcast industry in the United States, is actually a very inexpensive way to get additional broadcast spectrum. It's the least expensive way that they can get that additional spectrum. But as to why high-definition television is not likely to catch on very quickly, I think you have to walk up to people in the street and say, what's wrong with television today? And most people's answer won't be that the picture is no good. Okay, you see, we got television in the early 1950s. And the engineers who designed television in those days weren't stupid. They designed a television system that would give you a picture that looked good in a normal room for the normal size television set that you would expect to have during the lifetime of the standard. And they were right. It isn't until television sets gets much, much bigger than 21 inches that the picture starts to become less than very good. So in fact, until you have a very big screen, the difference between high definition and normal definition television is lost on the average viewer. So the demand is not there. This is not the same as high fidelity equipment, where the more money you spend, the better the sound is, and that difference in sound is evident, whether you can enjoy it or not. So the demand is not there necessarily from the consumer's point of view for higher quality in the television for most programs. And the demand is certainly not there by the broadcasters, because the broadcasters already have the spectrum. What the demand is there for, however, is diversity. Okay? The demand for more different kinds of television. And indeed in America, what the broadcasters are allowed to do is, instead of broadcast a high-definition television program in the new channel that they have been given to do that, they can broadcast 5 or 6 or 4 different programs. And that's an opportunity that for most times of the day will catch on. But the interesting thing is that that's a digital television broadcast. And what that means is that at the flick of a switch, the TV broadcaster could be sending out 1 high-definition television program, 4 regular programs, or 3 regular programs in a paging channel, or email, or internet access, or virtually anything they want. And they can make that decision on a second-by-second basis. Now, if they do make that decision each second, how many seconds of the broadcast day do you think would be spent on high definition versus all the alternative uses for the bits that the broadcaster can radiate? My guess is, with the exception of the Super Bowl and the World Series and the World Cup in soccer, most of those bits will go to things other than definition.
Norval, por favor.
Sr. Lippman, eu quero deslocar um pouco a nossa atenção da televisão para um aspecto um pouco mais global da sua reflexão. Pelo que nós tivemos acesso a respeito do seu trabalho, nós estamos aqui diante de um grande especialista em futuro. Eu quero falar um pouco, e gostaria de ouvir a sua opinião a respeito deste futuro, mas do ponto de vista da comunicação e da comunicação primária. Evidente, todo o aparato comunicativo que os últimos séculos desenvolveram privilegiou a visão como o órgão do sentido primordial. E eu gostaria de saber se esse predomínio da visão dos olhos deve continuar nos próximos séculos, ou se todo o desenvolvimento tecnológico vai também buscar novas mídias que estimulem o tato, o olfato e ainda, sobretudo, a propriocepção, que é o órgão de percepção do corpo todo. Estão sendo consideradas as possíveis alterações do corpo diante de toda a máquina? Será que nós estamos diante, finalmente, de uma aproximação entre corpo e máquina que foi criada artificialmente pelos últimos séculos? uma vez que novos aparatos estão sendo desenvolvidos que auxiliam o próprio corpo na leitura dos seus próprios sinais?
There are two or three questions hidden in what you said, some of which I know something about, and others of which I don't think anybody knows anything about. The eyes are a parallel input device, okay? And that is to say you take in information all at once from all over. And they are the best parallel input device that we have. When you hear things in your ear, by and large, it's sequential. When you touch things, by and large, it's comparatively sequential. We tend to use all possible modes of communication whenever we communicate. We use gesture, we do indeed use smell, and we certainly use most all of our senses, and we also use touch. And there are very important occasions where touch is a wonderful way of communicating, and things that you couldn't communicate other ways you would use touch for. Certainly, we focus on the eyes as well, but I don't think that the eyes get undue focus. They get focus probably in proportion to their bit rate. And eyes are high bit rate devices, so we get lots and lots of energy devoted towards them. With respect to the other things, we do no work in our laboratory on things such as direct stimulation of your nervous system. So we're not a biology laboratory, and we do no invasive things. We do most of our things through the senses. But imagine, for example, that if you could wear a jacket, okay, and imagine that that jacket could stimulate your body with a sense of touch, with various kinds of things. And I don't care whether it does it by electrical impulses, I don't care whether it does it by simply having the cloth tighten up so that it makes you feel something different because of what your clothes are wearing. Well, you know, no human being was meant to walk upright, okay? And so after the age of 35, almost all of us have a back problem of some sort or another. Now, a great many of those back problems could be solved if I taught you how to walk and how to get into and out of a car in such a way that it wouldn't hurt your back. Now, imagine if your clothes did that, okay? And as you got out of the car, your clothes tightened up, or maybe even yelled in your ear, or maybe even gave you a shock and said, "You're getting out of the car the wrong way. That's going to hurt." In a week, I'll bet I could cure whatever back pains you have. And when you lift up the groceries and walk up the steps and open the door and slip, if my clothes can talk to my skin and signal me, then I'll bet you could learn those wonderful things. So I have a feeling that when you think about using the other senses, you're thinking about a kind of communication that can be immensely beneficial in those kinds of areas, but not necessarily in the areas of communicating thoughts between us and other people, but rather communicating things about our environment directly to our body in ways that we don't want to intrude upon things like the eyes and the ears and the mouth for. So I think those will come along, but for a very different purpose than what we originally thought.
Marco, por favor.
Professor, aqui. Eu queria lhe fazer uma pergunta de curto prazo. O senhor acha que a curto prazo a interface entre nós e a rede, entre nós e a internet, vai ser uma interface que passa pelo telefone? Quer dizer, nós teremos um telefone inteligente, ou que passa pela televisão? Nós teremos uma televisão muito inteligente. A curto prazo, porque a muito longo prazo, provavelmente a rede vai ocupar o mar e nós teremos peixinhos navegando pelo mar, tá, não teremos problema. Mas a curto prazo, o que acontece? É cabo ou telefone que vai dominar a forma de transmissão de informação a curto prazo na internet?
Every time that I've thought that one would dominate and another wouldn't, the other one seems to wake up. This year, the excitement in the United States is on cable modems, and the cable television industry is installing them as rapidly as they can. And there are only 100,000 of them or so in use in America today, but that number is limited by the number of installers. It's not limited by demand, so it's just beginning. And it's fantastic. Everybody who has one loves it. It's high speed, it's 24 hours a day, and it's everything you could want. This is not coming in through your television, but it is coming in through the cable wire. that your television is also attached to. Well, last week, the telephone companies and several computer manufacturers, Intel, Compaq, and Microsoft, for example, as well as 4 of the 5 major telephone operators in the United States, announced an equivalent to the cable service that was going to work over the telephone network. And they call it Digital Subscriber Loop, or DSL for short. Now, if they get started and catch up, then suddenly all of our energy and attention will be focused on that. In the end, there probably won't be one wire.
Yeah.
And hopefully in the end there'll be no wire, that it'll go through the airwaves. Because it's kind of ironic that we're built upside down, aren't we? It's an old American joke. Does your nose run and your feet smell? Well, if that's the problem, you're upside down. Well, we seem to use the airwaves for our television signals, even though we sit down when we watch television.
Yeah.
And we use the wires for our telephone and computer signals, even though we move when we use those. So in the end, perhaps the most exciting things to develop will be the radio connections that allow us to keep in motion, like in our car. But in the short term, you can't pick a winner between cable and telephone. They're both gonna be there.
Hélio, por favor.
Professor, vamos voltar um pouco para o planeta Terra. É o seguinte, as pessoas falavam em viagens espaciais, falavam que o homem ia colonizar a Lua, ia para Marte. Hoje, com o fim praticamente de todas as utopias sociais que a humanidade tinha, a tecnologia é o que restou de utopia nas nossas mãos. E nós estamos aqui falando de jornais que vão ter a notícia impressa na hora que as pessoas vão ler. Estamos falando de roupas que a gente veste, que nos ensinam postura. Estamos falando de uma série de coisas que, por mais que haja realidade técnica para executar, o fato é que elas vão ou não se tornar uma realidade concreta no dia a dia, se as pessoas quiserem ou não. Quer dizer, há um lado utópico em tudo isso que a gente fala. Agora, com a internet, por outro lado, surgiram uma série de outros problemas que são questões potencialmente explosivas e nada utópicas, que a gente já vive hoje. Como, por exemplo, a questão da propriedade intelectual. Você poder copiar e distribuir qualquer coisa que seja transformável em bits com a maior facilidade. A questão da segurança da informação e da criptografia. E o governo americano faz questão de poder interceptar e decifrar qualquer mensagem que seja transmitida pela rede. A questão de material agressivo, pornográfico, violento, que a gente quer controlar, não quer que os nossos filhos vejam. Eu queria saber o seguinte, se não está na hora da gente deixar um pouco a utopia de lado e falar realmente do que pode acontecer de problema, porque se a gente não começar a agir agora, essas coisas podem, no futuro, nesse futuro, o mesmo futuro que a gente está falando, se transformar em coisas verdadeiramente explosivas e levar até a guerras, não?
Well, there's a big difference between something that's simply good and something that's also idyllic, like the beaches around here, and something that's utopian. And I'm never an advocate of a utopian anything. Utopias imply that all of society agrees in advance to do something one way, and that then they'll all get along doing that. And I've never endorsed or been an advocate of a utopian view of anything. And the interesting thing about the internet is it's exactly the opposite of that. What does happen on the internet is something that happens from the grassroots. It does not happen by design. And utopias, by definition, happen by design. So what you're seeing on the internet, you're seeing because the people who are engaged individually around the world, old, young, rich, poor, black, white, from every corner of society have made it happen. And they have found a global community out there, and they are building it up themselves. That's not utopian, and it's not even idyllic, but it's damn good. Now, what it's doing is not forcing any of the problems you mentioned to exist. What it's doing is it's forcing governments around the world to recognize that these are problems and to address them in a unified way. Intellectual property is not a problem unique to the internet. It is a problem because in France you can't copyright a movie. You can only copyright the words and the song and the picture separately, whereas in America, you can copyright a movie. In France, you're not allowed to put an advertisement on a telephone answering machine, but in another part of the world you can. And in China, copyright tends to be violated in the interest of industrial development, but that would not be tolerated elsewhere. So the problem of intellectual property is not a problem that's created at all by the internet, and in fact it's only aggravated by it in a minor way. What's aggravating our concerns about intellectual property is the fact that suddenly governments have to recognize that they're functioning in a global environment. Now, there is an element of that that is forced by the internet and forced by digital technology that could be delayed otherwise, perhaps. And the element is, when you make a copy of something digital, then that copy cannot be distinguished from the original. Whereas 100 years ago, if you made a forgery, you could imagine a chemical test that might reveal that forgery. So the problem is more complicated, but it's not changed in its fundamental essence. And the existing structures and laws for dealing with things like intellectual property are in general well suited to deal with it in the internet, but they lack the agreement and they lack the force for it. The same is true for pornography. There's nothing wrong with pornography. There is something considered wrong with obscenity, for example. And obscenity is a different matter from pornography entirely. There are laws in the United States that prevent child obscenity and child pornography. Those laws work. You simply have to arrest the people who do it, and they'll use the internet or any other means to deliver it, and we'll arrest them with any of the techniques that we have to arrest them. So I don't think that we're at the threshold of utopia, because it's the opposite. We have no agreement at all. But I think we are at the threshold of an era where we will have to force our institutions to think about these problems in a global way, and that's something that they haven't had to do before.
E elas estão preparadas para isso?
No. No, they're not prepared for it. Because governments move more slowly. But I'll tell you, we have a group of kids that we're organizing around the world, and we're forming a thing called the Junior Summit at MIT. And in November, several thousand kids who will have been engaged in a forum for 6 months around the world. Okay, these are kids from all of the countries and all of the world, will be engaged in discussions of what the information future means to them. And that's more important, I think, than what it means to us. And we're going to give computers to the kids who don't have them so that they can participate in this kind of forum. And those kids will select 200 or 300 representatives to go and have a summit at MIT. And it will be the first of many summits. And I think that group is well organized and well suited to invent a way for them to work in cyberspace in a country of their own, with no national borders, but with coherent intellectual property, security, and protection laws.
Dr. Lippman, agora há pouco o senhor falava da possibilidade da informação varrer o mundo de um lado para o outro, e de que isso, obviamente, é quase que uma forma impossível de se deter a informação. Na década de 70, talvez baseado no livro do George Orwell, 1984, se falava muito do perigo do desenvolvimento da televisão e que poderia haver um domínio de país ou de pessoas ou de povos e que isto seria uma meta a ser alcançada no final do século XX. Eu gostaria de perguntar ao senhor o seguinte: está afastado definitivamente o perigo de um totalitarismo tipo Big Brother?
No, that danger's never gone. Okay, this is sort of the same nonsense as intellectual property and all of those other things. Every time the people get their hands on a vehicle for communication, somebody has to decide that they shouldn't have it. And so let's invent a reason why it's really no good. And maybe it's really no good because they're not smart enough to understand it, or maybe it's really no good because they'll lie on their taxes, or maybe it's really no good because all they'll do is sit around and watch pornography, or maybe it's really no good because they won't get educated or because they'll revolt. So it's never possible to say that we won't have a totalitarian result, because the totalitarians have not disappeared off the face of the earth. They're still trying. But technology argues against it, okay? Because the technology here is a fundamental democratizing agent. It cannot do it itself. And it certainly does require our vigilance and our support. But on the other hand, it's on our side. So we have to hope for the best. And I tend to hope and work for the best.
Mr. Lippman, a indústria de computadores ainda produz máquinas indecifráveis ou impenetráveis para a grande maioria das pessoas. Hoje, uma pessoa de boa escolaridade, inclusive, tem dificuldade de entender por que quando leva o carro para consertar, o mecânico não diz que ele precisa fazer um upgrade para que o carro funcione, ou coisa semelhante. Quando é que se pode esperar que a indústria de computadores comece a fazer máquinas realmente amigáveis, em que não seja necessário saber uma quantidade infinita de informações a serem digitadas?
Yeah, it's truly amazing, isn't it? I mean, you know, here we have computers that are immensely horrible. They're ugly, they're hard to use, they tend to break, and they tend to destroy all our data. All we do is get mad at them, okay? And probably part of the reason they break is because we hit them so much. And we have, on the other hand, the internet. And I don't know how much time you spend on the internet, but if you do it on a normal telephone line like most of us, then it's terrible. It's slow, it gives you the wrong answer, it breaks before you get any answer at all. So it's pretty terrible too. So here we have a combination of an absolutely terrible box, the computer, with an absolutely terrible wire, the internet. But 75 million people around the world are using it. And some of them are using it for 40 hours a week. How do you explain that? And the only answer you can explain is the same answer you had to give when people tried to drive automobiles when they had to push 78 pillars and turn a crank in order to get their car started. It got them where they wanted to go. So fundamentally, the reason that the internet caught on is because of the convergence of 2 or 3 things. Okay, one of them was the cost of the personal computer. Bad as it is, and I agree with you, it's terrible. Bad as it is, dropped below the cost where it could start to move throughout society, where it could move from the office to the home. So the cost went below that threshold, and that's important. The second is the web, which is not the whole internet, but it is a part of it that most of us see quite often. The web presents one interface to all kinds of data, and that one interface is not as complicated as Microsoft's operating system or Unix or any one of a number of things that typically get you much madder at the computer. So we have a combination of ease of use that suddenly got better with the web and price of access that suddenly dropped with the advance of technology. And that's the basis for why it caught on.
Mas essa população não está próxima do limite. A tecnologia dos PCs, dos computadores pessoais, tem mais ou menos a mesma idade do que a tecnologia, ou pelo menos o uso mais disseminado da tecnologia das TVs a cabo. E o uso, por exemplo, nos Estados Unidos de TVs a cabo é infinitamente superior ao uso de PCs em residências. Essa dificuldade de se fazer uma máquina realmente amigável, realmente barata, não pode criar um hiato entre o crescimento da rede e a sua necessidade de expansão?
Well, yes, look, we're not done yet, okay? We're not finished yet, okay? The machine right now is at the stage of the crank start automobile, okay? And I think that what's going to happen over the course of time is you'll start to see those machines become very much different devices from the devices that they are today. In our work, we look at a few ways in which we can cause that change to occur. And one of the ways is to take the machine, or to take your use of the network, to take your use of communications, and take it away from your desk, and throw away the desk entirely, and start to build it into the environment. So we have people in the laboratory, for example, who have built reflecting pools of water. And you shine a light into the pool of water, and the waves reflect themselves on the ceiling, and if you get email, the waves get more agitated. And we've made clocks where an image of the sunset appears on the clock. So you can use your clock as a window and start to see a little bit about what it's like outside. And we've built things that take that and move it into your environment so that you don't have this machine on your desk that you sit in front of and focus on and look at and use completely when you want to communicate or when you want to access information, but rather that information starts to become spread throughout your environment, throughout your house, throughout your car, and the like. I hope that that can start to make it simple and casual. When you read a newspaper, you don't only go to one chair, put your back in the chair and put the newspaper in front of you. You read it on the train, you read it while you're in the airport, you read it online, and you do it when you want to do it, not when it wants you to do it. And I'm hopeful that some of these kinds of amenities can make computing be something you do when you want to do it, not when it wants to do it.
Mr. Lippman,
That seemed to get some questions answered.
O senhor falou de copo que treme, entendeu? Sua água treme e tal. Eu vi uma foto na webpage do Media Lab de um sapato. Era um sapato desses Nike que tem um PC na sola. Você anda com ele e enquanto você anda, você recebe dados, recebe assim e e-mail pela sola do sapato que o transmite para o seu relógio, para o seu PC de bolso. Uma das formas de transmitir essas informações é pelo corpo humano, sinais elétricos passando pelo próprio corpo humano. O senhor não acha que uma tecnologia como essa tem que vencer o preconceito de muitas pessoas que vão sujeitar a deixar um sapato passar corrente elétrica pelo seu corpo? Não acha?
People are going to have problems with that?
Eu acho que sim.
They are? Why?
Preconceito. Por exemplo, o videofone. O videofone. Já faz... Diga.
The video phone is doing something nobody wanted,
Yes.
and not doing it very well. Okay?
Right.
Telephones are great. We don't need to change them. Okay? Half the people in the world have never used a telephone, and for most of those people, it's a 2-mile walk in order to use a telephone. So the challenge of the telephone industry is very clear. Get a telephone to people. You don't need to make video, just get people telephones. It's clear, if half the world hasn't used one. So video phones is something nobody ever wanted, and you know, I don't see that it's comparable. On the other hand, the ability for our things around us to communicate with each other is something that you might well want. You might well want it because it means that when you walk into a store, the store knows it's you. Mm-hmm. And the salesman who knows your size and the person who knows when you last bought a suit is suddenly part of the environment of shopping in a way that you never had the opportunity to make it before. You might want things like your shoes to communicate so that when you walked into the house, it knew you weren't a burglar. But in fact, what we also put into the Nike shoes was we're putting into those shoes the ability for the air in the heel to also power some of the rest of the devices around your body. And so that as you walk, in fact, you're recharging your watch, and you're recharging your pager, and you're recharging your cellular phone. And so there's getting some energy, some extra free energy from just the things that you do when you walk. I'd like to give you one example of where this kind of communication across your body starts to become useful and starts to become interesting. I would love to make a device that allowed my wedding ring to communicate with my briefcase, because that would mean when I went to the airport, you couldn't pick up my briefcase. It would send an alarm. Only I could pick it up because it knew that it was my hand that was touching it. And when I went to the ATM, my wallet worked because it's in my hand. Okay? And when the Federal Express man comes to deliver a package to you, he can only give you the right package, and he can only give that package to the right person. Okay? Right. So to the extent that these are things that people want to do, then they'll do them. But understand, my laboratory does not build products. The laboratory builds ideas. And we put those ideas sometimes into things that seem like products, more to stimulate your thought than for you to go out and buy them.
Professor, se o senhor tivesse um grande jornal numa grande cidade ou uma TV local, com os conhecimentos que o senhor tem, em função da explosão da internet, o que o senhor estaria fazendo com essa empresa?
You know, I think the people who own the TV channels, much as I think about them as off in their own world, are actually probably better at running TV channels than I am. And if they listened to me, they'd be broke. But one thing is clear, and that is, if you're in the television business or even in the news business, you have to think about it the same way that the publishers thought about it in the world of books when suddenly everybody had a press. And no longer was there a guild that gave them a monopoly. The major publishers thought about where their value was added to the chain, and they thought about what value they could bring to the relationship with the consumer. And they're still around, the publishers who did that. And if you look at the networks in America, they're starting to try and create a brand name around themselves. They probably would do better if they hired the resources of Fisher Justice to do that for them, because I don't think it's something that they can do all by themselves, because they're only in one industry, whereas companies that tend to be in the broader business of communications might give them a broader view of that kind of thing. But these days, you have to view your business, its equity, its only equity, is in its relation to the customer. It's not in the presses, it's not in the antennas, it's not in the cameras. And so therefore, the only guideline is you do what you can to build that immediate communal response and responsiveness to your audience.
Professor, o senhor vem de um lugar, o Media Lab, que é um dos laboratórios mais badalados ultimamente, em parte em virtude da explosão da internet. O senhor acabou de falar que lá vocês não fazem produtos, mas ideias. O Media Lab é um lugar interessante porque ele tem um esquema de financiamento que é em grande parte privado. Eu gostaria que o senhor escrevesse esse sistema e me dissesse dessas ideias o que já chegou na mão do público e o que está para chegar em pouco tempo, exceto os livros do Nicolas Negroponte, que esses todos nós conhecemos.
There are three ways that things get out of the laboratory. One of the most interesting ones is the way that you never see us as having been connected to it. And I'll give you an example. In the days when the people at Apple were developing QuickTime, okay, which is a way of delivering little moving pictures to your computer screen, we were working on things that were similar to that and had been working on it for many years. Those people learned about what we were doing, and it served two purposes. One of them was it gave them an initial understanding as to how to go about doing it. And the second one was it gave an argument to their management that they should do it, because they could always say, but those crazy guys at MIT are doing it also, so we should be able to do it too. But by the time QuickTime came out, it was re-engineered in their image, and QuickTime was really their invention by then. So they got a start from us, and they got a justification from us, but the product, QuickTime, is truly their own. And so there's products like that that come out of the laboratory, but you don't see them as laboratory products because our intervention was earlier at a more strategic level. Now there's a second class of products that do literally come out of the lab. I have to tell you one story. I have a friend from a company in Japan, NEC, and I knew him because he was involved in making monitors. And one day, he visited the laboratory and said, "What's new, Andy?" And I said, "Phil, let me take you to the basement and I'll show you what we're doing with the kinds of sensors that detect your body. And they can be used for very inexpensive mice and doorways and all those kinds of things." Well, I didn't know that this person from NEC had been transferred from the television division to the automotive division. And he went down to the physics room with me just because he was a friend, and he took a look at our sensing apparatus and said, "Ah, I can use this to detect when someone's in the car seat in order to know when the airbag should go off and when the airbag should not go off. And last June, I went to visit BMW in Germany, and they picked me up and they said, be careful when you sit down. You're sitting down on a seat with one of the experimental NEC MIT seat sensors. So that's a second way. Some of the technology really does get out, and our technology is in those kinds of car seats. And the third way is that the students graduate and they start their own businesses. 3 years ago, Patty Mays in the laboratory was working on something that she called agents. And these were devices that brought people together and allowed them to collaborate automatically on the network. And I can explain that in great detail if you like. But 3 years ago, nobody was interested because it was just an idea. It was just a thought. It was just a glimpse of the future in one professor's mind. But 3 years later, those are suddenly very popular. And her graduate students who did that work went out and formed a company, Firefly. And Patty taught a seminar on how agents work. And a group of students from the business school formed a company after going to her seminar, and they did the software for Amazon.com, the largest bookseller in the world. And Patty's students went out and they built their company, and they did the software for Barnes & Noble. So not only have we gone from the laboratory into the world, but we've got two companies that both came from the lab that are now competing with each other.
E é por isso que as empresas continuam a investir, então, no Media Lab.
I hope that the primary reason a company invests in the laboratory is for the strategic guidance that they get from doing it. I hope it's because that they come in and they get to see a lot of experiments that it would be very difficult for them to do on their own. Perhaps because they're a newspaper and they don't have that kind of laboratory, or perhaps even because they're IBM or AT&T, but they're focused on meeting different business goals. So I would hope that the value companies get is they get to see 175 crazy kids all doing things that they wouldn't do themselves, but looked at all at once might give them their own ideas.
Dr. Lippman, eu já vi aqui o senhor fazer comparação, pelo menos com duas mídias. Uma, o jornal impresso, e outra, a televisão de uma forma geral. A impressão que eu tive de tudo que o senhor disse é que à informação estão ligados dois fatores, a imagem e a interatividade. Nesse mundo, onde há espaço para a sobrevivência do rádio broadcasting, do rádio aberto?
Well, radio is already surviving on the internet. Okay, the systems programmer on the 4th floor in our building is Greek, and he listens to the radio from Greece every day, coming out of his computer while he works. My Australian student listened to the World Cup finals last year on the internet, being broadcast live from Australia. So again, I think there's plenty of room for all of those media on there. What I'm looking for, and what I work on specifically, and I have graduate students working on this, is to build that convergence in the same kind of wire, an internet-like wire. See, these days you hear a lot about convergence. You hear a lot about digital convergence. All of our media are digital. Our printed word, our sounds, our pictures, our actions are all digital. That's true when they are produced. Okay, you submit your book on a floppy disk, you do your newspaper reporting at a computer console, you use digital cameras, and you certainly use digital audio recordings. But it's not true as it's delivered to the customer. We still broadcast television with AM and FM, the way it was done 40 years ago. We still broadcast radio, AM and FM. We still distribute newspapers on large, relatively static displays. What some of the students in my group do is try and make that delivery channel convergent. And if we can start to move the architecture and speed of the internet to allow television, radio, and some kind of high-density news, like newsprint, to flow through that same wire, then suddenly this global email and this global web becomes a global broadcasting system with sound and light and so on. And that's where I think we'd like to head. And I only wish we could get there faster.
Professor, O senhor não acha que a internet e a web dentro dela é algo muito americano demais? Quer dizer, nós vivemos um planeta onde mais de 3/4 da população nem usam o alfabeto que nós costumamos usar, para não falar da língua inglesa. Quer dizer, todos os chineses, japoneses usam kanji para escrever, não conseguem escrever no nosso alfabeto. Os indianos não usam o nosso alfabeto. 1 em cada 5 habitantes do mundo sabe mal e mal inglês, mas os outros 4 não sabem. Não é muito americano demais esse produto novo?
Absolutely. And not only that, you're absolutely right, and it's worse than you think.
Yeah.
Okay? Well, I mean, but just go in America to the Indians in the West. The Indians on the West, when they want to express themselves, they don't use a mouse. They use the earth and the sand, and they draw large. And so not only are we constraining people with these very American-like inventions, but we're focusing them onto tiny, tiny little screens and tiny, tiny little actions, which is not in the cultures of some societies at all. The only thing I can say in answer to that, and there is no real answer, is it's not over yet, okay? And the web is not the end of communications. The internet is just the highway, but the vehicle that you put on it can be anything you want. And if you don't like the web, don't expect it to stay around for very long.
Mas o senhor não acha que isso é uma razão a mais para não ser tão otimista com o advento de novas tecnologias quanto o senhor me parece ser? Eu explico. Há 100 anos atrás, um jornalista, um escritor francês, publicou um artigo num jornal de Paris, o J'accuse, e conseguiu mudar uma política de Estado. E a política anterior era mais autoritária que a política posterior. Eu sou de um país onde a imprensa, por muitos anos, hoje em dia nem tanto, mas por muitos anos se manteve criticamente em relação ao poder. Sempre tomou uma posição crítica em relação ao Estado. O senhor não tanto assim, mas enfim, no Brasil nós sabemos o que isso quer dizer. Com o advento de uma mídia, onde no lugar de ter um editor ou 5 empresas, o senhor tem 1 milhão de editores para 5 milhões de leitores, será que a gente não enfraquece a força política progressista dessas mídias? Porque nem sempre a mídia é autoritária ou defende os interesses do grande irmão. Às vezes ela ajuda as pessoas a mudar a vida para melhor, entendeu? Muitas vezes aconteceu isso na história. E isso, o que eu sinto muito trabalhando na rede, eu não sei se o senhor tem essa noção, é de que quanto mais nós avançarmos numa diluição infinita das mídias em 500 mil, 1 milhão, 10 milhões de editores, menos importância terá a opinião de 1 ou 2 pessoas e, portanto, isso é bom por um lado e é ruim por outro, porque às vezes as opiniões são positivas, são progressistas, enfim.
Right. Look, first of all, you're never going to destroy my optimism.
Eu tentei.
Because I firmly at heart believe that increasing communications increases democracy. The problem that you're raising is a complicated one that I don't think we can solve tonight, and we'll have to do it wrong for 10 or 20 years until we finally get the right answer. But at what point is there too much democracy? Is it good for a town to have 1 newspaper? Is it good for it to have 10 newspapers, or is it good for it to have 1 million newspapers? And I think we all agree that 1 is no good. Whether it's a voice for good or a voice for bad, 1 voice is no good.
Yeah.
I think we might agree that 10 is a good number, and I think we'd agree that if we got up to 100,000, there aren't enough good writers and editors to provide those 100,000 newspapers.
Se arruma.
The internet is the technology that lets you have 100,000 newspapers, but it's society that decides whether you have 1, 10, or 1 million.
Dr. Lippman, Marcos, por favor.
Andrew, você comentou sobre o crescimento estrondoso que a internet tem tido nos últimos anos, mesmo sendo uma mídia difícil de lidar, lenta, onde a ligação cai, etc. Mesmo assim, muita gente está usando isso. Ao mesmo tempo, o senhor comentou sobre o crescimento de aplicações de acessos como de cable modem, que permitem que a velocidade de acesso seja muito maior, a disponibilidade o tempo todo, etc. Existem várias tecnologias e nós sabemos que a internet vai passar a ser muito mais rápida. No entanto, hoje, as aplicações elas são desenvolvidas para essa grande massa de pessoas que usam no modo lento. Eu queria saber, na visão do senhor, quais serão as principais aplicações comerciais da internet que vão ser viabilizadas pelo alto desempenho, aplicações com multimídia, com realidade virtual, etc.
I don't know what kind of words you're allowed to use on Brazilian television. Virtual reality is virtual nonsense. It's like video telephony. I don't think anybody's sitting there waiting for it. The resonant chord in society that caused people to use the internet in the first place is partly interactivity, as you were talking about earlier, but it's mostly participation. It's mostly the fact that they were members of a community and they found people who could become members of that same community on the network. So in a sense, it's like the biggest, what we call bait and switch in the world. And that is to say, the bait that gets you involved is the web, but when you get involved, you switch over to the community. You switch over to email, you switch over to chat rooms, and you start to use the web as a vehicle for person-to-person communications. There is no critical bandwidth for that, and that's why I think the internet catches on, even though it's slow, ugly, cumbersome, and sometimes stupid, because you don't need a lot of bandwidth to be able to join a community. What you need is the breadth, the responsiveness, and the access, and it certainly provides that. But as the access and bandwidth start to go up, then that's when I think we'd like to see our other media start to converge in that same wire. If only for the reason that we wouldn't have to have arguments about HD TV versus regular TV versus 6 channels versus 6 million channels. But when you start to converge those things in one delivery medium, those are decisions that you make on the fly and that the consumer can make as he watches. He'll buy more bits if he wants a better picture and has a bigger TV, and he'll buy fewer bits if he wants less pictures. So I think that's when we need the bandwidth.
Entendo, mas no laboratório do MIT vocês estão já criando algum estudo no sentido de disponibilizar aplicações que podem ser comerciais, que justamente aceitem esse conceito de comunidade, de pessoas relacionando-se com grupos, mas ao mesmo tempo usando a maior largura de banda, que possam oferecer mais do que simplesmente a troca de comunicação via texto?
Actually, we don't. No. The threshold that we push at the laboratory is much more the threshold of comfort than it is the threshold of bandwidth. With the exception of one project dealing with trying to get things like television and broadcasting concepts into the internet. Because right now the internet really is a person-to-person phone network. It's not a broadcast medium at all. With the exception of that, actually we spend most of our time trying to think about whether we would like our clothes to be also musical instruments, and whether we would like our microwave oven to ask the food seller how we should cook the food for us to give us help in doing it, or whether we would like to build a bicycle that 2 people can take across the country, and at the same time we can track them on the network and monitor them to see when they're tired or to see when they're working too much and need to stop for food, or to see whether we can build things like cars that understand where we want to go when we turn the wheel. And so the car works with us to avoid the pole in front of us as opposed to just avoiding a skid. So we tend to work on the interface to the network and the ways that that interface now can become part of the rest of our lives. And we focus away from the bandwidth.
Senhor Lippman, o senhor afirmou em uma de suas entrevistas ter bom conhecimento da cultura e dos fenômenos culturais, do que corre na televisão e da dificuldade que a televisão tem de ter softwares mundiais. Enquanto o hardware é mundial, os softwares são mundiais. Então eu vou fazer uma pergunta muito local, baseada na sua afirmação de que o único software que parece viajar ao redor do mundo é a telenovela brasileira. Eu gostaria que o senhor nos contasse um pouco a respeito dessa sua experiência, se o senhor conhece a telenovela brasileira e em que medida o senhor conhece e por que seria pelo fato dela surgir de...
Only a little.
Bom, ainda bem, né? Sorte.
They're not available on my cable system.
Seria o fato dela surgir de uma sociedade multicultural, como a sociedade de onde o senhor vem, mas de certa medida, em certa medida, aqui um pouco mais acentuada?
I don't know that there's any answer for that, but several years ago I was flying back from Japan, and I was flying back with Stan Hubbard, and Stan Hubbard has a set of broadcast stations in the United States, and he was one of the people responsible for direct TV, which you have in Brazil now. And Stan believed at the time that if he had 250,000 people in America, okay, he could build a profitable broadcast service for those 250,000. Now, in my community, there's only a small Brazilian section, and there's no Portuguese television station. And in another community elsewhere, likewise, there's not enough. But taken together, there's more than 250,000 of them. And so that's the reason for building that kind of global access. That plus the fact that it sure would be nice when I came down here to visit you for me to still watch my city council meetings back home. But those are the cases.
Mr. Lippman, o crescimento e a expansão da internet podem estar limitados a um fato: o sucesso comercial ou não da utilização da internet. Empresas e indivíduos têm investido muito dinheiro na internet e não têm tido retorno disso. De outro lado, tudo indica que a internet tende a pulverizar audiências, como o senhor mesmo comentou, o que dificultaria, por exemplo, pelo menos pela cultura corrente hoje no meio publicitário, investimento em publicidade para, por exemplo, patrocinar o investimento de meios de comunicação na internet. Como é que o senhor vê esse desafio da internet se transformar mesmo num meio de geração de riqueza? Fora o fato de que hoje a internet, nesse campo, é basicamente um shopping virtual.
Well, first of all, there are businesses that clearly work on the internet. Okay, Marshall Electric advertised on the internet 2 years ago. This is a large electrical distributor, and suddenly found themselves doing business in 52 countries around the world. So there are clearly cases where the internet fits into your business plan. Amazon.com is a wonderful case of where the internet fits into their business plan. The more interesting stories that have to do with commerce simply has to do with the very fact that because of things like the network, commerce works better. And when commerce works better, it's not because they're an internet company, it's simply because they're using communications to work better. I'll give you an example. Federal Express, the large shipping company, lets you track a package on the network, okay? And if you access the network, you can find out where your package is. Now, of course, you never need to do this, because Federal Express is so good at delivering it that no one ever even bothers to track their package. They just go to the front door, and the man is there on time. But Steelcase makes office furniture. And lo and behold, Steelcase wrote a program to automatically access Federal Express's tracking software, so that the customers of Steelcase, when they called up and said, "Where are all the keys to my file cabinet that I lost that you promised you would send me today?" Steelcase, for its customers, could look to Federal Express and find out exactly where they were. Now, the customer never saw Federal Express in that transaction, but Steelcase's business suddenly worked much, much better. So those are the kinds of models I think you want to look for. I think you want to look for the fact that suddenly it's a new business environment and you can exploit that breadth and extent of the network, not just for advertising and communications directly, but also sometimes for the operations of your business. And that's a large part of why it will be a success.
Dr. Lippman, de acordo com o senhor disse, a gente não corre o risco também de ter as informações privilegiadas na rede internet apenas para as pessoas que podem pagar por essas informações? O senhor veja que, no começo, você podia acessar sites de muitas empresas ou de muitos novos centros de informações na internet. Na medida que você se acostumou a chegar até esses sites, a utilizá-los, eles estão sendo gradualmente fechados e você tem que pagar por eles. Então, será que nós não teríamos aí uma substituição da democracia na rede internet por uma plutocracia? Ou seja, só quem tem realmente dinheiro poderia ter acesso a essas informações?
Certainly a very real danger. And, on the one hand, I wouldn't want business not to do that. I think business has to experiment. I think business has to try, and somebody's got to pay for this damn thing. So I'd sure like business to take the money from the wealthy and build the communication systems for all of us. You can't have them not try. I guess the exclusivity doesn't exist whereby it can only be by a plutocracy, okay? Because no matter how much one company charges, another company can start to do it for free. And so therefore, there is no monopoly control over these kinds of things. But your more serious part of your concern is absolutely true, and it is one that we likewise work on at MIT as well. And that is, how can we make access simply not be the province of those with enough money to be able to provide access? We have an organization that we have been associated with, and we started in the laboratory, called 2B1. The number 2, big letter B, and a 1. And the purpose of that organization is to provide internet access, mostly for kids, anywhere in the world. And one of the ways that it goes about doing that is seeing if it can borrow bits from satellites that have been launched 10 years ago and aren't in use anymore, because replacements have been launched up, but they work. They just don't work well enough for a commercial service. And so we're asking those companies to donate those extra bits in order to provide access for the kids. So I think you have to work on it, you have to support it, and you have to try very hard in order to avoid the dangers that you're talking about. They're real, and we want them too, but we want it for everyone else also. And it's a task that we as humans have to adopt.
Professor, eu tenho uma questão voltando à questão da interatividade. Muita gente fala do modelo de negócios que vai se desenvolver em torno da internet, pensando nela como um meio para difusão de informação, broadcast, como é a televisão, como é o rádio, como são os jornais. Outras pessoas pensam em algo próximo, mais próximo do que a rede telefônica, uma coisa mais interativa. As experiências que foram feitas com interatividade, eu me refiro especificamente às experiências de video on demand, que era um sistema através do qual as pessoas poderiam acessar os filmes que quisessem para assistir em casa, num lugar remoto. Essas experiências, por enquanto, não redundaram em nada. Foram feitas experiências em Orlando, na Flórida, no Japão, em uma cidade, no estado de Nova York, em Rochester. Eu lembro de um título de uma reportagem que disse: o dia que o povo de Rochester viu o futuro e bocejou. As pessoas querem mesmo interatividade? E será que é possível criar um modelo de negócio que sustente isso? Quer dizer, que dê dinheiro para as empresas que vão oferecer serviços interativos?
A lot of those interactive services were junk. They were a good first experiment, but they weren't the real thing. The Florida experiment was done before the internet, and it was done purely as a video-on-demand experiment. I'm less sure about Rochester. I met a very interesting cable system, and these people had an idea. And the idea was we would take 4 extra channels on our cable system, and we would simply replay television programs from the previous part of the week a second time, okay? Now, imagine that you missed this television show, but you didn't know you wanted to watch it, okay? So you didn't set up your VCR to record it for you, even if you could. But instead, the show went, and the next day at work, somebody walked up and said, "Did you see that television show last night?" And you said, "No, I didn't even think to tape it." Well, here on these extra channels, you'd be able to kind of catch up. So I call it second chance television. It's not video on demand, and I'm not sure that video on demand anybody demanded. On the other hand, it is the convenience of kind of having that library that you can return to when you missed yesterday's newspaper, or when you missed a movie and get to see it again from the video store, or when you missed a television program. And those are the kinds of amenities, and those are the kinds of things that I think will start to catch on. But they will never catch on in the way that will pay for themselves for a single cable operator the way the Rochesters and Florida examples worked.
Rodrigo, por favor.
Eu acho que nós estamos falando aqui que, se você pensar no modelo de negócio das empresas de informação hoje e transpor para a web, evidentemente que não tem negócio. Agora, você tem que levar em consideração que nos últimos 100 anos, nos últimos 30 anos, os jornais pararam de crescer proporcionalmente à população das cidades. Quer dizer, as ferramentas que os jornais tinham para cobrir a comunidade que ele estava inserido não evoluíram. Quer dizer, como você vai cobrir uma cidade como São Paulo jornalisticamente falando? É uma abstração.
Não vai.
Quer dizer, a internet ela é um conjunto de comunidades em informação. Quer dizer, as tecnologias hoje desenvolvidas, sem pensar em virtualidade, sem pensar em nada, são coisas absolutamente revolucionárias que, na medida em que a população for assimilando isso, aumenta a perspectiva desde o favelado da beira da Marginal do Pinheiros até a nossa. Né? Então, bom, estou me saindo do entrevistador para entrevistado, peço desculpas aí para o senhor e para o público. Né? Mas quer dizer, você tem empresas hoje, multinacionais, que vivem em função do advento das redes de comunicação, não da internet, são redes próprias. Quer dizer, uma Reuters da vida tem 400 mil terminais no mundo servindo a comunidade internacional, uma Bloomberg tem 100 mil, uma Dow Jones, que é minha parceira no Brasil, tem 140 mil terminais. Quer dizer, são 600, 700 mil pontos do setor mais rico da nossa economia que se comunicando 24 horas por dia, fazendo o fluxo dos capitais saírem, e isso um dia vai ocorrer nas comunidades que estão inseridas dentro da internet. A base monetária mundial vai começar a circular numa velocidade que a gente jamais imaginou. Quer dizer, o europeu, quando ele saiu da América, ele não descobriu a América, ele saiu por uma necessidade econômica. E na medida em que a base monetária que circulava no mundo conhecido, que era o mundo europeu, passou a circular no mundo como um todo, o mundo enriqueceu. E é esse o processo que nós vamos sofrer, que nós devemos sofrer com a internet, com todos os riscos que você, em qualquer processo novo, você sofre. Né? Eu queria a opinião do professor Lippman a propósito da minha tentativa de fazer uma exposição.
It's great, keep going. Yeah, you're right. Look, we have both a consumer face on the network and we have a business backbone on the network. And sometimes we make the mistake of looking for business to appear in the consumer face when in fact the business is doing quite well in the background with only occasional bubbles up into the top like Amazon.com and those kinds of examples. So I think you've got it exactly right, and we'll stick around and see.
Dr. Andrew Lippman, nós estamos chegando ao fim do nosso programa e eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta final ao senhor em relação ao que o ser humano pode esperar no próximo milênio, no próximo século. A impressão que a gente teve é que a tecnologia, na primeira revolução industrial, na segunda revolução industrial e agora no que se chama de terceira revolução industrial, está se acelerando cada vez mais. Há uma aceleração cada vez maior no desenvolvimento da tecnologia e na sua utilização para a humanidade. Para onde isso vai nos conduzir?
I think this is going to lead us to a world where all of the people in all corners of the world are participants in it. That not just those who are geographically well placed, but those who are highly motivated is going to be the future of what the world is going to be. It's not going to be centered in Europe, it's not going to be centered in America, it's not going to be centered in Japan. Hopefully it's going to be a world that's diffused throughout all of the people, no matter where they are. And if there's one thing that communications can bring us, it can bring us the promise of that hard work, good learning and good thoughts won't be hindered by being in the middle of the Amazon or in the middle of the Ganges. They can suddenly reach fruition anywhere. And that's hopefully what this revolution will bring us.
Ok, thank you, Dr. Lippman. Bem, o Roda Viva vai chegando ao final e nós queremos então agradecer aqui a presença do professor Andrew Lippman e também a colaboração da bancada dos nossos entrevistadores. Agradecemos também a sua atenção e lembramos que o Roda Viva estará de volta na próxima segunda-feira, às 10h30 da noite. Até lá, boa noite, tenha uma excelente semana e muito obrigado pela participação e pela audiência.